A racist teenager approaches an old woman in the park and starts harassing her. He stands tall and smug, his energy buzzing with a toxic arrogance that seems out of place in the serene setting. Ada Brown sat on the bench near the oak trees, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had come here to enjoy the cool breeze and the chirping of the birds. A small solace she allowed herself in her retirement. Her cane leaned against her knee, and her eyes were closed, taking in the peace that the world rarely offered her. The boy's footsteps were sharp and deliberate as they approached. Ada opened her eyes slowly and glanced up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The young man, not more than 17, stood in front of her with a smirk on his face. He had scruffy brown hair that hung carelessly over his forehead and wore a hoodie that looked 2 sizes too large. His demeanor was confrontational, even without him saying a word. "Hey, lady," he called out, his voice tinged with mockery. Ada met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Afternoon," she replied, her voice steady. The teenager's smirk widened as he rocked back on his heels. "You got nothing better to do than sit around all day? Must be nice having everyone take care of you." Ada adjusted her posture slightly, her hand tightening around the top of her cane. "I earned my rest after a long life of work, young man. Sitting here doesn't hurt anyone." "Yeah, sure," he scoffed, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Bet you were one of those housekeepers or something. Cleaning up after people, huh?" Ada's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "I was a nurse, helped people when they needed it most. That's something to be proud of." The boy's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Yeah, well, I'm sure they were all real grateful," he sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Must be tough not fitting in, though, always being on the outside looking in." Ada's gaze didn't waver. She had heard words like these before, had endured their sting countless times over the years. "Every person has value," she said quietly, "even those who don't see it in themselves." The teenager leaned forward, his smirk growing sharper. "Value, huh? That what you tell yourself? Seems to me like you're just here because you got nowhere else to go." Ada inhaled deeply, refusing to let the boy's words shake her. "I'm here because I want to be. This park is for everyone." The boy chuckled, shaking his head as if he found her response amusing. He bent down and picked up a small pebble, rolling it between his fingers. Sure, he muttered. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the pebble at Ada's feet. "Guess you're used to people throwing stuff at you, huh?" Ada's hand tightened around her cane again, but she remained seated, her expression calm but stern. "Son, you're playing a dangerous game," she said. "You ought to think about what kind of person you want to be." The teenager laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "I know exactly who I am," he retorted. "I'm not the one sitting here pretending to be important." He flicked another pebble, this one bouncing off the toe of Ada's shoe. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You can walk away." "Walk away?" the boy repeated, his smirk twisting into a sneer. "Why would I do that? This is fun." He took a step closer, towering over her. "What are you going to do, huh? Call the cops?" Ada's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't answer. She had no intention of escalating the situation, but she also wasn't going to let the boy intimidate her. She had faced worse in her lifetime, and she wasn't about to back down now. The teenager seemed frustrated by her lack of reaction. He bent down and picked up another pebble, this one larger than the others. "Come on, old lady," he taunted. "Show me what you've got." Before he could throw it, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey! What's going on here?" Both Ada and the teenager turned toward the sound. A police officer was jogging toward them, his expression stern. The boy's bravado faltered for the first time, his hand dropping to his side as the officer approached. The officer stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting between the teenager and Ada. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Ada straightened her back, her grip on her cane loosening slightly. "No problem on my end, officer," she said calmly. "This young man was just about to leave." The teenager's face flushed, and he stuffed his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, I was just messing around," he muttered. "Didn't mean anything by it." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Messing around doesn't include harassing someone," he said firmly. "I saw you throw something at her. You need to think about your actions, son." The boy shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence completely gone. He mumbled an apology under his breath and turned to walk away, his shoulders hunched. The officer watched him go before turning back to Ada. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Ada nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm fine, officer. Thank you for stepping in." The officer nodded and tipped his hat slightly before walking away, leaving Ada alone on the bench once more. She leaned back, letting out a quiet sigh. The park was peaceful again, but she knew the encounter would linger in her mind for a while. As she watched the leaves rustling in the breeze, Ada couldn't help but wonder about the boy. What had led him to act that way? What kind of life had taught him to lash out at strangers? She hoped that someday he would find his way, that he would learn to see people for who they truly were, rather than what he thought he saw on the surface. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Ada closed her eyes again, allowing herself to sink back into the quiet rhythm of the park. Life would go on, as it always did, and she would keep moving forward, one step at a time. The next day, Ada returned to the park at her usual time. She carried a book this time, a worn novel she had read countless times before. It was more for comfort than entertainment, a familiar escape she could retreat to if the world became too much. As she settled onto her favorite bench, she noticed a figure standing by the fountain. It was the boy from the day before. He wasn't alone this time. Another teenager, slightly older and wearing a leather jacket, stood next to him. They seemed to be talking, their heads bent together as if conspiring. Ada's stomach tightened slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm. She opened her book and pretended to read, her eyes flicking up occasionally to watch the two boys. After a few minutes, the older boy pointed in Ada's direction. The younger boy hesitated, glancing at her before looking back at his companion. The older boy said something else, and the younger one nodded reluctantly. Together, they began walking toward her. Ada closed her book and placed it on her lap, her hands resting on top of it. She met their approach with a steady gaze, her expression neutral. "Good morning," she said as they stopped in front of her. The younger boy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the older boy. The older one crossed his arms and smirked. "Looks like you're making friends everywhere you go, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Ada raised an eyebrow. "I don't believe we've met," she replied evenly. "Is there something I can help you with?" The older boy chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, just thought we'd come say hi. My friend here said you had an interesting chat yesterday." He elbowed the younger boy, who flushed and looked away. Ada's gaze shifted to the younger boy, her expression softening slightly. "It's never too late to apologize," she said gently. The younger boy's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "I didn't mean to," he stammered, but the older boy cut him off with a laugh. "Don't waste your breath," the older boy said. "She doesn't care." He turned to Ada, his smirk widening. "You don't care, right? You're just sitting here waiting for someone to feel sorry for you." Ada's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone calm. "I'm sitting here because I enjoy the peace and quiet. If you're not here to enjoy the park, I suggest you move along." The older boy's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "You've got some nerve, lady," he said, stepping closer. "You think you can just sit there and act all high and mighty?" Ada didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her book and opened it again, her eyes scanning the page as if he weren't there. Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate him even more. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he snapped, reaching out to knock the book from her hands. Before he could make contact, the younger boy grabbed his arm. "Stop it," he said, his voice shaking. "Leave her alone." The older boy turned on him, his expression incredulous. "What's your problem? You scared of her or something?" The younger boy shook his head, his grip tightening on the older boy's arm. "No, I'm scared of what's going to happen if you keep pushing people like this." Ada watched the exchange silently, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. It seemed the younger boy had learned something from their encounter after all. The older boy scoffed, pulling his arm free. "Whatever," he muttered. "I don't have time for this." He turned and walked away, leaving the younger boy standing awkwardly in front of Ada. The boy hesitated for a moment before meeting Ada's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For yesterday, And for today. Ada closed her book and gave him a small smile. Apology accepted. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. The boy nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Thanks, he said before turning and walking away, his steps lighter than they had been before. Ada watched him go, her heart full of hope. Change was possible, she thought. Sometimes, it just took the right moment to spark it. She leaned back on the bench and opened her book again, letting the peace of the park wash over her once more.